So good afternoon, and thank you for joining the annual World Wetlands Day Research Symposium at the University of Waterloo. My name is Philip van Capellen. I'm a professor here at the University of Waterloo, host today. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. My home is located on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River. So I'd like everybody to take a moment and acknowledge and appreciate the enduring role of indigenous peoples as stewards of our shared land, water resources, and particularly relevant today, our wetlands. World Wetlands Day marks the date of the adoption of the Convention of Wetlands 50 years ago, on February 2nd, 1971 in Ramsar, Iran. The convention, which is usually known as the Ramsar Convention, is an international government agreement acknowledging the importance of wetlands, and it plays a central role in the conservation of these critical ecosystems. Canada is a signatory of the convention and currently has 37 sites designated as wetlands of international importance, also known as Ramsar sites. On February 2nd, events are held around the world to celebrate wetlands. At the University of Waterloo, the Eco-Hydrology Research Group has been organizing the annual World Wetlands Day Research Symposium since 2013. This year marks our 9th symposium, and it will comprise the 5 upcoming talks by young researchers from the University of Waterloo, Wilfrid Laurier University, and McMaster University. As you probably know, in addition, we will have a distinguished lecture and a panel discussion later this evening, co-hosted by the Waterloo Public Library. This symposium would not have been possible without my colleagues on the organizing committee, which includes Harriet Bigas, Lyndon Fairbairn, Ferdun Rezanezad, Maria Strack, Scott Davison, and Steph Slowinski. I also would like to acknowledge the continued support of the University of Waterloo's Water Institute, as well as the Faculty of Science, with special thanks to Heather Neufeld. Just a few housekeeping items. So we've asked the speakers to limit their presentations to 12 minutes as to leave some time for questions. So if you have a question, please write it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And because of time limitation, it is possible that we're not able to have all of your questions answered live. So I recommend that you leave your name and contact email in your question, and we'll make sure the speaker then gets back to you. So as you can see, we have 5 speakers lined up. And so without further ado, I invite Owen Sutton to give his talk entitled Modeling the Hydrochemical Trajectory of a Constructed Fen Watershed, Implications for Landscape Scale Wetland Reclamation. Please go ahead, Sutton. Owen.
Okie dokie, great. Thank you very much, Philippe, and thank you to the rest of the organizing committee for putting this unusual World Wetlands Day together. So I'm a student, a PhD student with Jonathan Price at the University of Waterloo, and I'm in the Wetlands Hydrology Lab. And I'm going to be talking to you about some work that I've been doing for the last chapter of my thesis, which is on modeling the hydrochemical trajectory of a constructed fen watershed and the implications for landscape scale wetland reclamation. So surface mining in the Athabasca oil sands region has disturbed over 900 square kilometers of boreal forest and peatlands. And on some mine leases, wetlands account for over 60% of the pre-disturbance landscape. The majority of these wetlands happen to be fen peatlands, which are minerotrophic wetlands that receive groundwater input. And the major oil companies are required to reclaim the land to a pre-disturbance land capability, which in essence means an ecosystem of similar form and function. But there's a number of pretty big challenges to wetland reclamation in the area. And that includes the large variability in climate, both seasonally and between years. And in particular, precipitation is highly variable from year to year. Also, potential evapotranspiration typically exceeds precipitation on an average annual basis. And so it creates a potential for moisture limited conditions. Also, there's a limited availability of construction materials that have the appropriate hydraulic characteristics. and a lack of prior practical knowledge on fen construction and fen research on fen construction in the Athabasca oil sands region presents some pretty big hurdles that need to be overcome. So in 2013, a constructed fen pilot project was completed known as the NIKANOTEE Fen Watershed. And it was built to develop some of this research and operational knowledge that's going to be needed to accomplish fen reclamation on a much larger scale in the future. And the site was built using both process affected and salvaged materials. And so these materials include petroleum coke and coarse tailing sand, which are both byproducts of the bitumen extraction and upgrading process, and salvaged peat and forest floor material, which are taken from areas that the mine is expanding into. The site itself consists of a 2-hectare fen, an 8-hectare upland aquifer, and 22 hectares of surrounding reclaimed hill slopes. The upland was included to direct groundwater to supplement the fen during dry periods. And both the fen and the upland were underlain by an impermeable liner to prevent seepage losses to the much deeper regional water table, and also to direct groundwater to the fen. The tailing sand that was used to build the upland aquifer contains residual quantities of sodium from the oil sands process, approximately 350 milligrams per liter at our site. And this is anticipated to migrate to the fen with groundwater flow and could negatively impact the fen vegetation that's being targeted. And so this leads us to a few research questions that we want to answer. For starters, what peak sodium concentration could we expect at the fen surface where the plants are going to be growing? Will this concentration exceed salinity-related stress thresholds for these targeted vegetation species? How long will it take to reach this peak concentration and for solutes to be totally flushed out of the system? And will prolonged droughts cause persistently low water tables? These research questions have been addressed with the aid of numerical modeling, and the model projects the probable trajectory of the system into the future. So the model that I used is a 3D groundwater flow and transport model called ModFlow-Surfact. And the model was parameterized using a very large and comprehensive suite of field and laboratory data, 7 years of data. And the model was calibrated to 2014 to 2016 and validated with site data from 2017 to 2019. And this included 27,000 hydraulic head measurements, 800 daily actual evapotranspiration measurements from an eddy covariance tower in the fen, and 130 sodium water samples. Now, we anticipated that climatic variability would play a really important role in assessing the suitability of the fen design. And so projections of groundwater flow and sodium movement use the Monte Carlo method. And that's basically just randomly sampling from a known probability distribution. And so the model ran 50 Monte Carlo realizations of statistically stationary climate. And each realization consisted of 30 years, and each year had 183 days of groundwater flow and transport. It wasn't a full year, 365 days, because the fen freezes solid in the winter and there's no solute transport. So each realization had randomly sampled meteorological conditions of recharge, precipitation, and potential evapotranspiration. So the fen water table fluctuated between 20 centimeters to 3 centimeters below ground surface, but was typically just about 10 centimeters deep. So really close to the surface and a very small range of fluctuation. Microtopography at the site meant that there were areas that were consistently drier and consistently inundated, leading to the formation of persistent ponds. And as expected, the water table responded to evaporative demand. The water table was highest in the spring and late fall and lowest in June and July when the evaporative demand was highest. And while the fen rarely evaporated at the potential rate, it was typically able to meet about 70 to 80% of evaporative demand in my projections. So this graph shows the solute mass export, the total solute mass in the system, and elapsed time post-construction on the x-axis. And the black line that you can see represents the ensemble mean. And what that is the average of all 50 climate realizations. And you can see each individual realization that looks like spaghetti. So on average, export of 50% of the total sodium mass in the system was achieved by about 14 years post-construction. But the difference between really wet and really dry years was substantial, and it spanned 13 years. And you can see that with the orange arrow. The rate of mass export progressively diminished over time, and extrapolating this pattern even further into the future would suggest that the removal of the remaining sodium mass is going to take several decades longer. And so this graph shows surface concentration over time in the fen, average surface concentration. And recent research has allowed these model results to be put in the context of salinity stress thresholds for some of the targeted vegetation species. Work that was done by Dale Vitt and colleagues last year suggested that a stress threshold existed for Carex aquatilis, which is a targeted species of sedge in the fen. And that threshold exists somewhere between 1,100 and 2,300 milligrams per liter of sodium. But for many bryophytes or mosses, a stress threshold was found to be much lower by Pulio et al. In 2013 to be around 300 milligrams per liter. And again, depending on climate realizations, the peak surface concentration could be highly variable. It could be as low as 400 milligrams per liter and occur after only 8 years of post-construction, or it could be as high as 950 milligrams per liter and occur 20 years post-construction. But in general, the ensemble mean suggests that most probabilistically likely peak concentration is around 600 milligrams per liter and peaks after 12 years. And so this is higher than the stress threshold for mosses, but most importantly, it does not exceed the most conservative stress thresholds for Carex aquatilis. Now, the previous graph masks the considerable spatial differences across the fen. And this series of figures shows the surface concentration of sodium across the fen over time. The first 6 of these pictures illustrates transport that's already happened during the calibration and the validation periods. And during this time, the transition between the upland and the fen, which you can see at the lower portion of all of these pictures, it experiences the highest concentrations of sodium. And microtopography seems to have a really big impact on the geochemistry. It creates hotspots from evapoconcentration, and they can be right next to areas that have much, much lower sodium levels. Due to evapoconcentration, the sodium levels could be up to 6 times greater than the initial concentration in the tailing sand. And some areas of the fen could potentially exceed salinity stress thresholds of Carex aquatilis, but they're small and isolated and limited in scale. The northwestern portion of the fen will likely take many decades to flush due to its distance from the outflow. It's a little bit tough to see, but the little cross in the corner is the outflow or discharge location, and the proximity to this discharge location seems to have an important impact on the geochemistry. So what does this all mean for the fen? Ultimately, these projections, I think, are pretty optimistic and positive. They represent sort of a validation of the original design philosophy and principles that guided the creation of the watershed in the first place. Increasing the area of fens relative to uplands to be closer to the natural landscape likely won't be detrimental from a water table perspective, but it could decrease the surface water discharge. And since that's the only method of solute removal, it could lengthen the amount of time for the fen to flush and could increase peak surface concentrations. Carex aquatilis and another targeted species, Juncus balticus, will likely be the dominant vegetation species for the first few decades post-construction, And this is due to their salinity tolerance and the favorable water table conditions in the fen. And I think that the design of this watershed could probably be reproduced at a much larger industrial scale. However, attention will need to be given to stagnant or isolated areas of the fen that will evapoconcentrate salts. And this could be managed with modifying surface topography or adding multiple discharge locations. So in conclusion, climate variability has a really remarkable impact on the timeline associated with sodium transport. The difference between above and below average climate realizations can impact flushing times by over a decade and peak concentrations by a factor of 2. Water table conditions and salt concentration will be appropriate for Carex aquatilus growth, but the elevated salinity in the fen, which will be temporary, will likely limit moss development across the site. And ultimately, above background sodium concentrations will persist for many decades, but they will always remain far below that of natural saline fens in the region, which have sodium concentrations an order of magnitude higher. So thank you very much, and I would be happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Owen. So Harriet, do we have questions from the audience?
Yes, we do have a question that came in. Owen, where does Na in the fen go over time? To groundwater or to surface water?
Ultimately, it goes to surface water, but it is transported by groundwater from the upland into the fen. It's only removed entirely from the system through surface water. And so maintaining that quantity of discharge, which is unusual for a fen in this region, it has a lot of surface water discharge. It's the largest flux in the system. That's the only practical way that you're going to get rid of sodium. Otherwise, it just stays in the system and evapoconcentrates at the surface.
Okay. I think we also had a question from Feridun. His question is, how is the depth distribution on salinity in the fen? Can you comment in general about the depth distribution?
Yeah, actually, I have a figure that shows the calibration validation that I took out, but there will be a period when the entire peat profile in the fen is quite salty. That probably happened last year, like 2019 or 2020. So 7 to 9 years post-construction, the whole peat profile will be salty. But as time goes on and evaporation happens, the salinity becomes more like a thin veneer at the surface. And so that will be particularly bad for mosses, which don't have a system of roots, but vascular plants that may be able to change where they're getting their where they're drawing their water from in the peat profile will probably be fine with it. But yeah, so over time, the salinity gets concentrated at the surface and fresh water could be found underneath. All
right, thank you. We'll have to stop here because you've kept very nicely within your 12 minutes. So we'll like to go to the next speaker, who will be Kristine Haynes from Wilfrid Laurier University, and her presentation is entitled Wetland Transition in Thawing Discontinuous Permafrost, the Role of Hummocks and the Hydrology of Treed Wetlands. So go ahead, Kristine, and if you could go to the slide mode of your presentation.
Okay. There we are. Okay. All right then. So thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm Kristine Haynes. I'm a postdoctoral fellow working with Bill Quinton at Wilfrid Laurier University and the Scotty Creek research team. So the work I'm going to be talking about today is looking at wetland transition in the discontinuous permafrost zone, and really looking at all aspects of landscape change. And just to note that this work is a collaborative effort between the students and the collaborators listed on my first slide here. So we'll jump right in to begin with a bit of context then. Oops. Change this, there we go. So permafrost thaw is really catalyzing some significant landscape change occurring in the discontinuous permafrost zone. And this change is occurring both vertically, where we have elevated peat plateaus that are losing their permafrost because of warming temperatures and are effectively subsiding. And this degradation is also occurring laterally. So where we had large permafrost bodies covered by black spruce forests, are now receding essentially because they're transitioning into these collapsed scar wetlands that are permafrost free and are basically a saturated wetland. And so effectively what this permafrost thaw is catalyzing this area then is increase in wetland area leading to wetland capture, what we call, where we have these individual isolated wetlands that once the intervening permafrost bodies are thawing, then essentially we have a connection forming to the main drainage network, essentially enhancing the runoff contribution area of these permafrost dominated basins, and ultimately leading to a reduction in wetland water storage. So as these wetlands become connected to the main drainage network, then we have a decline in overall stored water on the landscape, with essentially these areas drying out. And so what we're observing this to lead to in this landscape then is the formation of microtopography in the form of hummocks, and the return of potentially black spruce forests, or at least tree reestablishment in the form of treed wetlands. And so that's really what we're going to talk about today then is what these treed wetlands are, how they are functioning hydrologically in the landscape, and what they mean for potentially a future landscape in this area with this catalyzing trajectory of change. So we'll jump right into research questions. So questions we're going to try and cover today then are: how prevalent are treed wetlands in the discontinuous permafrost landscape? If they're this advanced stage of change, an indicator of advanced stage of change, how much of this landscape type are we seeing in the permafrost landscape? What are their general characteristics? Do these treed wetland features have permafrost? They look like a black spruce forest, but are they underlain by a similar forest or a permafrost body? And what is their overall hydrological and thermal function in the landscape? So do they have similar properties to the typical collapsed scar wetlands and permafrost plateaus that we would typically see in this landscape, or are they indeed distinct? And then thinking broader picture, and really what we're most interested in is how this landscape is going to change ultimately in the future. And so what role might these treed wetlands play in this permafrost thaw-induced landscape change? So just to give you an idea of where we're working here, looking at northwestern Canada, Northwest Territories, the Scotty Creek watershed, about 50 kilometers south of Fort Simpson, Northwest Territories. So this is where this work is located. Thinking about then approach, we have, so this was done by a master's student a couple years ago, and he essentially looked at comparing in 4 locations in the landscape: a plateau, a wetland, and a collapsed scar, a treed wetland and a collapsed scar wetland, and essentially trying to compare their characteristics, starting pretty much from not knowing how these new, at least new to us, landscape features were functioning. And so setting out to make a more or less a comparison of their features. So essentially what we're looking at then is comparing these 3 landscape types in terms of their geophysical characteristics. So running ERT, or electrical resistivity tomography transects, to get an idea if they're permafrost or not. And then some general hydrological comparisons. So running snow survey transects at the end of season to see what kind of snow depth and water equivalent we have in these different landscape types, comparing them, monitoring frost tables, soil moisture, ground temperature, a whole host of different hydrological and thermal measurement techniques in order to make a comparison. So I'll go over some of these results today, just to give you an idea of how these landscape features are functioning. And then an undergraduate student in that same year looking at the biophysical characteristics. So in these treed wetland types, we're seeing these formation of hummocks and the return of black spruce. So taking measurements of the physical and ecohydrological characteristics of hummock and black spruce in each of these different landscape types, making comparisons of physical characteristics of hummocks. I'm going to go over height today and soil moisture, and essentially looking at why trees would want to establish themselves on these hummocks in these areas. So comparing hummocks with and without trees present to try and get at some of those questions as to what makes them so suitable for tree return. And then broader scale up, thinking about how prevalent these features are in the landscape, these treed wetlands, then looking at a classification, a supervised classification of these different landform types, including this newfound treed wetland, using worldview imagery and LiDAR to get at some of these broader scale questions. So we'll jump right into the landform classification then. Essentially what we're seeing then is that we have the peat plateaus are still the dominant form of land cover type in this area. Channel fens, which are the main drainage network in gray, very prominent as well. And this is the interesting result here, is that the treed wetlands are essentially on par with the amount of area covered in the landscape in this watershed as the collapsed scar wetlands. So what we're seeing potentially as being a treed feature, which we potentially would have classified as plateau just based on its black spruce cover, is actually a low-lying treed wetland. And it's quite sizable in terms of overall coverage. And if we zoom in on that area where we were looking at specifically with these itemized field-based measurements, then treed wetlands we can see are essentially either at the perimeter of these wetlands that have become connected to the main drainage network, or centrally. So depending on flow paths and drainage patterns, that seems to be where these treed wetlands are popping up on the landscape. That will become important later as we talk about thermal ideas of their purpose. In terms of subsurface characteristics then, so looking at an ERT transect here, going from a plateau on the far right side to collapsed scar wetland, treed wetland, and then collapsed scar on the far left. The higher resistivity values indicating permafrost, or at least the presence of ice, but in this case permafrost under a plateau. And really what we take away from this first ERT transect is that treed wetlands are essentially permafrost free. So no underlying permafrost within these land cover types. So even though they are forested, it's not supported by underlying ice. Another interesting result is looking at purely a treed wetland ERT transect now. We do see the presence of seasonal ice bulbs. So this is end of August, where we would expect, where we would look for measurements of permafrost. But here looking at potentially these ice bulbs, and since this was just a one-year study, this will require a bit more looking at to see if that persists and if that indeed will become permafrost or if it's just a seasonal presence of ice. Thinking about ground temperature then, comparing our collapsed scar wetland in the dark line, treed wetland in the intermediate line, and then peat plateau in the lighter line, excuse me, we essentially see at ground temperature around 10 centimeters that the temperature of treed wetlands is intermediate between those of collapsed scars, which are warmest, and plateaus, which are coolest. If we're looking at specifically the overwinter periods, there's a bit of interesting results here when we're looking at ground freezing. And so we see early on that the treed wetland seems to have a similar ground temperature pattern as those of the collapsed scars. But as it progresses into the later winter season, then we have a similar pattern as those of plateaus. So acting similar to each of the different characteristics or the landform types in this landscape, but at different periods of time. And so essentially potentially acting as a thermal buffer, whereas we have the warm collapsed scars that are essentially saturated and the drier, colder peat plateaus throughout the winter. These treed wetlands act essentially as a buffering capacity. In terms of snow cover and snow water equivalent then, This time the plateaus are in the darkest line and the collapse scars are in the lightest, again with the treed wetland in the middle. If we're looking at snow water equivalent and snow covered area on the right side in the dotted, again, the end of season snow depth and snow water equivalent is pretty much in between those plateaus and collapse scar wetlands when we're looking at treed wetlands. And so based on the forest cover amounts, and the potential for wind redistribution, we see that treed wetlands essentially act somewhere in between in terms of their coverage of snow. And so similar with that, we saw results of similar intermediate volumetric water contents in the soil within treed wetlands. And so if we think about it collectively in terms of their hydrological purpose or function in the wetland and the landscape here, it very much depends on where they're located in the landscape. So if we have a plateau with an adjacent treed wetland and a subsequent collapse scar, that's going to have a different approach in terms of their hydrology than if we had a plateau adjacent to a collapse scar and then we had a more centrally located treed wetland. So again, where we would have this buffering capacity potentially here, both thermally and hydrologically, adjacent to that plateau, maybe preventing some of that degradation. If we had an adjacent collapse scar, without the buffering, we may have severe degradation of that plateau on the landscape depending on flow patterns, but it may have an impact on how the landscape is structured as to how permafrost rates are changing. And so if we think about it then from a biophysical standpoint, so we make observations of these formation of hummocks with small black spruce saplings that seem to be establishing on these hummocks. And so what really is driving that in terms of the overall biophysical function of treed wetlands? So when we're comparing the hummock heights in these different landscape types, so our collapse scars, our peat plateaus, and then our treed bogs on the right here, we do find that we have trees located on the taller hummocks. So regardless of landscape or landform type, but that distinction is clear in the collapse scars and in the treed bogs or treed wetlands in this case. So that distinction is quite clear. So the taller they are, the trees seem to be established. And so as we're thinking about why that may be, what we're looking at then is terms of their control of soil moisture. And so if we look at the surface soil moisture, not a whole lot of difference in terms of significant trends, but if we're looking at the flank soil moisture, we do see a dramatic comparison here. So essentially, what may be controlling that presence of trees then is that intermediate soil moisture that may be leading to the successful establishment of black spruce in these landscapes, so leading to that forest return. So just to sum it up here, thinking about overall landscape trajectory then, as we have these collapse scars forming, draining as they connect to the drainage network and hummock formation, we may have this return of a black spruce forest, but without likely permafrost because we are in these warmer climes. And so just as a summation then, it's interesting to find that these treed wetlands are indeed permafrost free, but they do have the presence of these seasonal ice bulbs, and whether that's interannual ice is a topic for further discussion. A considerable portion of the discontinuous permafrost landscape is in an advanced state of change. And so we do see these impacts of hydrological and thermal buffers between these plateau and collapse scars. And it's very much dependent on the setting and the flow type sequence here that we're looking at. And we may indeed have the return of a black spruce forest because of these favorable soil moisture conditions in these areas. And a few acknowledgements, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very, very much for this very clear presentation. In terms of questions, actually, I had a question. I mean, and of course, you probably know what the question will be, but I mean, this is a very detailed study at a kind of a scale of a single site. How can you extrapolate those results then to a larger scale, or also in a longer temporal trajectory as climate warming would kind of favor this disappearance of the permafrost?
Mm-hmm. So this is an area that we're trying to focus on, is what's this going to mean long term, because like in initial modeling and previous studies would suggest that in order to have that forest cover return, they would need a permafrost underlying in order to actually create that. that ability to reestablish a black spruce forest. But what we're seeing with this permafrost thaw-driven change is that it's actually happening in the order of decades, so on the order of 40 to 50 years. And so essentially what we're comparing then is not necessarily the same thing, but as original models from back in the 90s. But essentially that's what we're trying to get at, is what this is going to mean long term. Yeah, it's a broad area that this is just a snapshot we're trying to cover here, but it will be an area of considerable study.
Harriet, do we have other questions from the audience?
Yes, we do. We have a question that came in from Veradun Rezenizad. He's asking, how does the formation of hummocks control the ground temperature?
So it's a good question. We had some probes right in hummocks, but that is one of the losses of last year's inability to get to the field sites, is not knowing what that data is going to yield. But in terms of exposure, particularly in the winter months, I think that extra added peat depth is going to provide a bit of an insulative capacity, particularly when we're looking at the hydrology as well. And so may allow for ice formation and further supporting the potential of ice formation. And so, yes, that would be another, it was kind of a fortuitous thing to look at, was the hummock formation at the same time. And so this is an area where we're going to examine quite further. So thank you.
Right. Thank you very much again for your presentation. We have to move on. So the next presenter will be Heather Townsend. So Heather, go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you, Philippe. Yeah, my name is Heather. I've recently wrapped up my master's thesis research with the Ecohydrology Research Group, and I'm excited to share with you today some research I've done on how Anammox may reduce methane emissions from wetland soils during the winter. As we know, wetlands play a crucial role in the global carbon cycle, as they hold a significant portion of terrestrial organic carbon. The role that wetlands play, however, in the carbon cycle is being threatened by climate change, which could slowly alter wetlands from being a sink for carbon to a source and producing carbon dioxide, the primary driver, of course, of climate change. Aggravated effects of climate change are expected in cold regions, and particularly during the winter. This hasn't not gone unnoticed in the literature, and there's been a lot of research into changes in Arctic and subarctic regions, particularly in permafrost, as we just heard Kristine discuss, but also in boreal regions. In fact, our own resident weather-telling groundhog has become more accurate with climate change, and he's also predicted in the last 10 years that 8 times spring would come early. So if anyone doesn't believe in climate change, you can always direct them to Waterton Willie. On a more serious note, we know that climate change has aggravated effects in cold regions, and this is important to peatlands who hold large amounts of terrestrial organic carbon in cold regions, not only in Canada, but in the rest of the world. Previously, soil restoration resulting in carbon dioxide over the winter and in cold regions has been disregarded, but this recent growing interest in winter soil processes has revealed that there is an active microbial community over the course of the winter, operating at lowered rates of reaction with the cooler temperatures. However, that microbial community is performing very distinct geochemical functions facilitated by the winter environment. Throughout the winter, the presence of snow and ice limit gas exchange in the soil with the atmosphere. This means that oxygen from the atmosphere is going to be unable to diffuse into the subsurface for microorganisms to use, and gases produced in the underlying unfrozen soil are also going to be trapped over time. In a ombrotrophic system, which perhaps relies on water inputs from precipitation, there's also limited hydraulic inputs over the course of the winter, further closing off this system until a melt event occurs. As a result, we develop a seasonally anoxic and closed system, forcing the soil microorganisms to shift away from aerobic metabolisms and towards anaerobic respiration pathways in order to meet their energetic needs. This usually begins with denitrification and ends with methanogenesis, with denitrification providing the most energy for microorganisms. This is crucial to the global carbon cycle, as 37% of Canadian peatlands experience seasonal freezing, meaning that changes, however small, in how carbon is mineralized over the course of the winter can have a very large effect. Wetlands, of course, produce a lot of methane and are the #1 contributor of methane to the atmosphere, regardless of their anthropogenic or natural sources. Methane is a more potent gas than carbon dioxide, although it can be exchanged between being methane itself, but it could be oxidized towards carbon dioxide as well. Climate warming is ultimately expected to increase methane emissions, particularly in northern areas with permafrost melting and freeing up more carbon. However, the amount of methane that will reach the atmosphere is dependent not only on how much methane is going to be created, but also transported and then consumed. Traditionally, we think of methane being oxidized to carbon dioxide here just by aerobic pathways, such as oxygen in the subsurface or in the atmosphere as well. However, anaerobic methane oxidation is a very big control on methane emissions from many ecosystems, particularly marine environments here that you see, which have much lower methane emissions than either wetlands or other freshwater systems. Recent interest in anaerobic methane oxidation has resulted in observations of this reaction occurring in a number of freshwater environments. In contrast, though, to a more traditional reaction pathway, such as denitrification, there's still more research that needs to be done on anaerobic methane oxidation, particularly because an electron acceptor dominant for oxidizing methane in a wetland environment is still unknown. Intuitively, though, it makes sense that methane can be oxidized in freshwater environments, as methane is created at depth according to the redox ladder and then must diffuse through the other redox layers as it makes its way to the atmosphere, meaning that methane could be used as an electron donor by any of these metabolisms that you see here as it makes its way out. But what if methane didn't make its way out? Because what if it is the winter? If methane is trapped in the soil surface for an extended period of time because of the formation of ice and snow, what would happen under prolonged closed conditions? For my master's thesis, I looked at how I could simply simulate a seasonally anoxic and temperature-controlled environment. To do this, I used a jar. I used a 250 milliliter septa jar, which was filled with cold, almost saturated organic soil. This resulted in gases being produced from the soil, of course, which would be trapped in the headspace and could be measured from the septa. And these soil jars were incubated at 5 degrees Celsius. The soil I used in this experiment came from the Turkey Lakes watershed, and I collected it from the peat layer of a hardwood swamp at the field site. The Turkey Lakes watershed is located just 50 kilometers north of Sault Ste. Marie, kind of at this junction where Lake Superior, Michigan, and Huron are meeting. It's on the edge of the southern edge of the Eastern Boreal Shield, so in that very climate-sensitive zone. The experiment used many soil jars that were sacrificed over time, and the jars were, the soil for the jars was dried and then re-wetted with different input solutions, so that way I could monitor how electron acceptor availability in terms of nitrate and sulfate, as well as glucose as an electron donor, would ultimately impact the reactions that I observed. These jars were incubated for up to 7 weeks and were sacrificed over time. The chemical, biological, and physical characteristics of the jars were defined from their predecessors because of the sacrificial design, which meant that the jars were allowed to develop relatively undisturbed up until when they were measured. A few overall biogeochemical trends can be identified looking at some of the pore water and headspace data here. I'm not going to really get into the niche parts of the different treatments that are across the top here of natural electron acceptor plus glucose plus electronic plus acceptor and glucose here, but instead look at the overall trends that we see in terms of changes in pH, nitrate and sulfate concentrations in the second row, nitrite and headspace nitrous oxide gas concentrations, and lastly, methane gas concentrations over time. On the x-axis here is the incubation time of up to 50 days. The experiment began with denitrification, as we might expect from the redox ladder. This was marked by a steep decline in nitrate concentrations, this blue line here, which reached a minimum value by day 8. At the same time, there was a huge increase in nitrous oxide headspace gas concentrations, peaking around day 8 as well. and that was slowly depleted throughout the next phase of the experiment, which was defined as a period of sulfate reduction and methanogenesis. Here, sulfate, this orange line, decreased over time towards the day 28 mark, and at the same time, methane also peaked at 28 days down here in the bottom row. Interestingly, though, what we can see here is an increase in this dark blue line, which is the nitrate concentrations up towards day 28, producing increasing concentrations of nitrate despite potentially active methanogenesis. There's also a very small increase in pH here. However, most of the pH increase occurs in the very last phase of the experiment, as the pH rebounds all the way from a equilibrium value it had reached of about 5.5 back up to about 6.7 or 6.8. At the same time, the methane concentrations that had peaked at day 28 begin to deplete, and they are stable and non-zero throughout phase 3 of the incubation period. Of course, in order for methane to be transferred back into carbon dioxide, it's going to require an electron acceptor, such as nitrate, sulfate, or nitrite. However, the concentrations of these species are actually increasing or stable during the period of anaerobic methane oxidation, making it difficult to identify what exactly was responsible for methane's oxidation. Another common electron donor, though, in solution was ammonium. Anaerobic ammonium oxidation, known as Anammox, is a well-known pathway, particularly in wastewater systems, where nitrate will oxidize ammonium, netting N2. However, in my experiment, we observed instead decreasing concentrations of ammonium outside of the denitrification period, instead in phase 2 or phase 3 of the experiment. Notably, there are some cases of ammonium oxidation occurring with manganese, iron, or sulfate reduction, which could produce nitrate and nitrite, these increasing trends of the dark blue line nitrate and nitrite that you're seeing down here. However, the only electron acceptor that was identified to be capable of oxidizing methane or ammonium underneath these conditions to create nitrate or nitrite was manganese oxides. Manganese oxides are a potent electron acceptor, and their production of nitrate or nitrite through Anammox could provide an electron acceptor for anaerobic methane oxidation in wetlands. This is then going to renew nitrate in the system, which could participate in other chemical reactions. So ammonium is oxidized to nitrate by manganese oxides, producing reactive intermediates such as nitrate itself, or also sulfate or iron, which could go on then to oxidize methane to carbon dioxide gas. These reactive intermediates are going to perpetuate the idea of cryptic nutrient cycling, ultimately masking how methane is consumed in the environment to produce carbon dioxide. Because these microorganisms who perform Anammox typically like to live in redox fluctuating zones, it's also possible that their close proximity to the aerobic layer masks this reaction network overall. Extrapolating the thermodynamics, though, over a range of pH and temperature revealed that the microorganisms performing these reactions and the energy that they receive is going to be dependent on environmental conditions, being pH and temperature. Microorganisms will only mediate reactions, or should only mediate reactions which give them energy, meaning that the Gibbs energy would have to be less than 0. Yet, under warm and alkaline conditions for some of the electron acceptors, this is not possible. Because of the large dependence you see here on the pH and the consumption of protons for these reactions of Anammox and anaerobic methane oxidation here, you can also observe a large change in pH, which could ultimately affect the thermodynamic favorability and whether the reaction will proceed in the future. Overall here, I observed that Anammox could provide an electron acceptor for anaerobic methane oxidation and limit methane and carbon dioxide release. That anaerobic methane and Anammox reactions are sensitive to pH and could potentially not be sustainable in poorly buffered soils that cannot maintain a low pH over the course of methane and ammonium oxidation reactions. And lastly, that winter soil environments may promote anaerobic methane oxidation because they trap methane and create a closed soil system. I would like to thank all of my co-authors for their time in helping to finesse some of this data, as well as I would like to thank Marianne and Siobhan for their assistance in the lab as well. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Heather. You were successful in putting a lot of information in a very short amount of time. So Harriet, do we have a question?
We do have a question that came in. Do you think that the relatively high ammonium concentrations that you observed in your soil from Turkey Lakes are unique to the wetland type, hardwood swamp? Could it be that tree leaf litter input is an important source of ammonium?
Yeah, I think that is definitely true. The site is going to be a forested hardwood swamp, and there are certainly very high concentrations of about 2 millimoles of ammonium initially. Although cell lysis from freezing and thawing of soil during the winter has been linked to increased ammonium concentrations too. And so potentially there's going to be a small increase as well of ammonium concentrations just at the front of the winter before we would expect this kind of system to take over.
Thank you. Is there another question? I don't think so.
We just got one that came in. Is on-site measuring being done of methane fugitive gas from the soil surfaces?
Yes, actually, there are a number of lysimeter projects active at the Turkey Lakes watershed. My understanding, though, is that they very rarely observe methane emissions from the soil. There was a project that was specifically focused on it, and they did not get very much methane data, which shows that despite the fact that wetlands are such a huge source of methane in this particular case, it is possible for methane to be oxidized as well.
All right. Thank you very much. So we're perfectly on time. So thank you again, Heather. And our next speaker will be Fred Cheng, who's been talking about managing wet landscapes, recovering and restoring and protecting wetlands that maximize nitrate removal across the United States. Please go ahead.
Great, thanks, Wade. Yeah, so today I'll be switching directions a little bit and looking at wetlands on the macro scale. I'll be really trying to explore the spatial patterns of the wet landscape in the US and how we can better manage it to see if we can get large-scale water quality benefits from it. So as we mentioned before, wetlands really help retain excess nutrients and can improve water quality by intercepting excess nutrients that's on the landscape and preventing them from going to like the rivers and lakes in our landscape. But unfortunately, we're not really doing a good job in protecting them always. In the last couple of years, there's been a lot of rollbacks on legal protections and pressures from development all over the world and even in our backyard, and we're losing a lot of these wetlands. So that's sort of the motivation of the work here that we're doing, is that oftentimes when we look at wetland removal, protection, or restoration, it's often conducted in a random or ad hoc manner. So maybe one farmer here protects this wetland, and maybe another one independently decides to protect another one on their property. So our question here is asking, how should we manage this distribution of wetlands in the landscape or the wet landscape as a whole to help protect downstream water quality? So some of the work that originated from our lab fairly early on was that just looking at how has these wet landscapes changed over time. So here, people from our lab basically looked at historical as well as high frequency or high resolution LiDAR data to see how have wetlands been removed in the landscape over, say, a couple hundred years. So historically, we found that there's this inverse relationship between size of wetland and frequency. So there used to be a lot of small wetlands in the landscape and some fewer large ones in the same area. But with developmental pressures, such as the agricultural lands and urban areas being built, we get a reduction of wetlands. Oftentimes we have to drain wetlands or remove them to build something in its place. So overall, that distribution has lowered, but there has been this preferential loss of these small wetlands in the landscape. So we might ask, well, does it matter that we're losing wetlands and in particular small wetlands? In our second paper, we basically looked at that specifically in terms of nutrient processing. And indeed, we did find that small wetlands are a lot more reactive than their larger counterparts, and they're able to remove more nutrients like nitrate and phosphorus at higher rates per surface area than their larger counterparts. So this fact, coupled along with the fact that there's a lot more small wetlands, means that these small wetlands as a collective size class removes a lot more nutrients in the landscape as a whole. So we did this at a fairly small region, and we want to build upon this, expand the scope and scale of it. So this paper that we published about a month and a half ago did just that. So we asked a couple of questions. We asked, well, first of all, what is the potential of these wetlands to remove nitrate across the entire US? So where are the potential sinks for nitrate in the landscape? And next, which hasn't really been done before, is to couple that with high resolution and a really large scaled data set of nitrogen sources of N surplus, and actually look at, well, if there's wetlands, is there nitrogen for there to be removed as well? And then, so this kind of starts to address where we should start protecting and improving our management strategies. And then we finally look at some management scenarios to see how best to optimize and direct restoration strategies to really maximize this nitrogen removal. So to do this, we leveraged the National Wetlands Inventory in the United States. So basically, this has the shapefiles and the locations of over like 30, 40 million wetlands across the US. And for each of them, we're basically able to estimate their hydraulic as well as their biogeochemical properties based on some established relationships that we derived earlier. And using those, we can essentially estimate for each wetland, what's the fractional N removal that they can perform potentially. So will this wetland remove probably 20% of the nitrogen, or this one here might remove like 40%. So after we have that for every single wetland, we aggregated that to watershed scale. So we took into consideration their contributing area. So how much area is actually belonging to that catchment area of that wetland. And we aggregated that to the HUC 8 watershed scale. So what that looks like is basically we're able to produce a map of basically for each watershed, how much potential nitrogen can it remove, independent of if there's nitrogen there or not. And you might notice that where the nitrogen is being removed potentially the most are areas where there's the most wetland. So in the prairie pothole region, along the Mississippi River, along the coast, those are the areas that have the most wetlands. So that makes sense. So that brings into the second part. So we know where nitrogen can potentially be lost, but is there nitrogen there to be lost? So here we used a very recent paper from our research group, where basically we have the nitrogen surplus values of every single county across the US for basically 90 years. So we took the very last year's nitrogen surplus to calculate what nitrogen is there. So the nitrogen surplus is basically a mass balance of the inputs such as agricultural manure going into the landscape, or fixation or atmospheric deposition, as well as what's coming out through crop harvesting. So this net amount of nitrogen is sort of the available nitrogen that's on the landscape that can potentially travel across the landscape, be intercepted by wetlands, or go finally into our rivers or lakes. So we remap this to the same spatial unit as our previous maps, to the HUC 8 watersheds. And we can see where the hotspots of N surplus is. So as expected, like the Corn Belt in California, as well as some areas in Florida and on the East Coast. So with this information, as well as that fractional wetland nitrogen removal map, we can combine those two to say, well, how much mass is actually being removed? And that's what we have here. So we estimated about 0.9 teragrams of nitrogen being removed by the wet landscape. But we noticed that this number is actually a bit lower than some older estimates in literature. We sort of asked the question why. So visually, we can see that these watersheds with the highest N removal isn't necessarily where there's the most wetlands or the most N surplus. And probably because there's these unique spatial relationships between the source and sink. And we'll explore that in the next couple of slides. So to do that, we basically plotted every single watershed on this XY plane, where X is the wetland density, where how much wetlands are there as sinks, as well as how much nitrogen is there on the y-axis for the source. So we separated this into quadrants, and we basically asked, where are these watersheds falling? In the top left quadrant, these are areas that are fairly low in wetland density, but high in nitrogen surplus. So these are areas probably rich in agriculture, and these are areas that we really need to look at in terms of trying to reduce nitrogen coming off of these landscapes. On the flip side, there are these areas that are these nitrogen surplus limited watersheds where they're more pristine. There's a lot of watersheds, and there's not a lot of nitrogen surplus. So these are areas that we do want to protect. In the lower left, so that's around 40% of the watersheds here, are areas that just don't have a lot of wetlands or inputs. So these aren't areas that we're too concerned about in this study. But the most interesting one is in the top right, where there is sort of this balance between the sources and sinks of nitrogen, where you do see a lot of nitrogen removal. And so we don't know which areas are probably considered like in danger zones, where they have a lot of nitrogen. And when we start thinking about restoration and protection, we want to start thinking about how can we move these watersheds that are in like the red zone, and maybe either lowering the end surplus or adding wetlands and moving them towards the blue area. And that's what we did in the next couple slides here, where we actually look at different management scenarios to see how can we maximize these nitrogen removal. So we did this at a more fine scale, at the grid scale. We did this at a 5 by 5 kilometer grid scale. And basically we asked through these simulations, if we restore wetlands to these individual pixels or these cells, either strategically or randomly, how does that reflect in terms of the total nitrogen loss? So what we did here, basically I'll show you 3 scenarios. One is a random placement. So there's basically no restriction unless there's existing water or urban areas or barren land, etc. And you can restore it anywhere. And you can see that in the US, the restoration is fairly uniform as expected from a random placement scenario. But on the second one, we look at still random, but we prioritize avoiding agricultural land. And we can see that in say, the Corn Belt over here, there's no wetland being restored. And then the third case, we have targeted restoration, where we actually go specifically where there's the most end surplus and restore wetlands there. So how does that correspond to the nitrogen removed? So you can see that at the lowest case, which is actually the no ag land loss scenario, we only remove an additional amount of 20 kilotons if we restore, say, 10% of wetland areas across the US. But if we restore the same amount of area, but be more smart about it in scenario 3, we can actually remove up to like 40 times more, up to like around 810 kilotons of nitrogen, just by placing them where they're close to the sources. And so you might ask, well, how does that cost? What does that translate into cost? So actually, all 3 scenarios are fairly close in cost. The targeted restoration costs the most because you do have to take land, agricultural land, out of production and account for that cost. But they're actually all within the same ballpark of existing costs and budgets for nitrogen reduction. So what does that mean overall? So when looking at the, like say, Mississippi River Basin, wetlands currently are removing a lot of nitrogen that's going to the Gulf of Mexico. Without the existing wetlands, we'd probably lose about, or we'd gain about 50% more nitrogen loading into the Gulf of Mexico. And then when we start thinking about targeted restoration, if you just look at the Mississippi River Basin, if we look at about 22% increase, we can actually drastically reduce the amount of load that's going into the Gulf of Mexico if we do this in a more cohesive and coordinated way. I think with that, I'll end it, and I'll be happy to take a question or 2. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much for this very interesting presentation. So do we have questions, Harriet?
Yes, we have a couple of questions. The first one, did you consider wetland types, example swamp versus marsh, in your estimate of end removal and restoration strategies?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we didn't distinguish the type as granular as that. We used more of the relationships that we've established before based on size, and did more of a Monte Carlo approach to try to estimate the ranges of behavior, because as all of you know, there's a lot of uncertainty and range of behavior that can happen at one singular site.
I think there was another question.
Yep. So the second question is, if we can't reduce the high inputs, high end surplus for the counties that are red, high source, low sink, what alternatives are there to wetlands that could provide an end sink function, since we can't restore wetlands in these counties? Are there any plans to model their sink function at the high spatial resolution that you did here?
Yeah, so very good question. So in terms of restoring wetlands, there is potential to restore wetlands even in the red watersheds or counties or pixels. A lot of times when we look at agricultural lands, there are like pockets of area where the drains aren't working, like the tile drainage isn't working, and they're already wet, and they're not actually producing at the same rate as the surrounding areas. So those are actually potential areas within agricultural areas that you can convert into wetlands and just have that being co-located really well with the nitrogen sources. And obviously there's a whole range of other strategies that you can do to reduce nitrogen, but obviously here we're looking mainly at wetlands, but there's a whole toolbox of best management practices that we can do to reduce the nitrogen surplus. And in terms of the sink function at the high resolution scale, yeah, that's a bit more difficult. There's a lot more complex like hydrology and pathways that you'd have to consider if you go really granular at this small scale.
Okay, so actually I had a question, because you seem to imply in your initial, the first part of your presentation, that while wetlands remove nutrients in general, like nitrogen and phosphorus, but very often what we see is that if you have high degrees of denitrification, you also have anoxic conditions which tend to release phosphorus under the form of phosphate. So there might be these kind of antagonistic effects on nitrogen versus phosphorus.
And phosphorus is definitely much more tricky in that aspect. So that's why for this one specifically, we did keep to nitrogen. For phosphorus, the temporal dynamics has definitely an extra layer of complexity that we don't want to go there yet.
But yeah, you will. All right, thank you so much. We need to move on now. And so our last speaker is Paul Moore from McMaster University, and he will present his talk called Survival of the Deepest, Peat Depth as a Control on Peatland Moisture Stress and Burn Severity. Paul, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. All right. Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Paul Moore. I'm a research associate at McMaster University with Mike Waddington. And as I just said, I'm going to give you my talk on survival of the deepest, peat depth as a control on peat moisture stress and burn severity. So getting right into it, peatlands are generally considered to be resilient to drought and wildfire. And this is because they have a lot of negative ecohydrological feedbacks and moss traits, which help to maintain a wet peat surface. But with future climate change, there's concern that cumulative impacts of potential increases in the length and severity of summer drought and also wildfire may exceed the capacity of these peatlands to resist or tolerate these types of impacts. In fact, some of our recent work on depth of burn in peatland margins would suggest that shallow peatlands in particular are vulnerable to wildfire. So what's shown here are some of the depth of burn measurements that we made at some sphagnum-dominated wetlands in the eastern Georgian Bay region of Ontario following the Parry Sound 33 fire of 2018. So not only does this show that peatland margins tend to lose a large proportion of their accumulated peat, so that's these white circles here, it also suggests that shallow sites, it doesn't matter if it's middle or margin, tend to lose a lot of their accumulated peat. So that's these regions or these sites here where even if you're in the center of the peatland, you lose a large proportion of that accumulated peat. So some of these findings from our fire research strongly suggest that shallow peatlands are more vulnerable to wildfire, where the difference in vulnerability between shallow and deep peatlands may be governed by either the presence or the strength of eco-hydrological feedbacks, which otherwise in kind of older or deeper systems tend to maintain a high water content in peatland soils. So the Rock Baron region in eastern Georgian Bay where this fire took place, it provides a unique opportunity for studying these shallow sphagnum-dominated peat systems, since they tend to be, these shallow systems in particular, tend to be fairly abundant on this rock barren landscape. So what we've done is set up a space for time study where sphagnum-dominated peat-filled wetlands, that kind of word jumble there is just because technically, if it gets too shallow, you can't call it a peatland. Whatever, so we've set up this space for time study with wetlands of increasing peat thickness, which is meant to represent peatlands across a spectrum of long-term peat development, which potentially have differences in vulnerability to both drought and wildfire. So in order to examine the ecohydrology of these peatlands, we monitored in detail 12 sites in total, where we split our sampling design into deep and shallow sites. And so the reason for this separation for comparison purposes, partly it's just driven by our research question of whether or not there's a big difference between shallow and deep sites. But as hopefully this diagram illustrates, it stands to reason that a greater proportion of the peat profile is going to be exposed to oxic conditions for a given climate region, and that with a greater proportion of the profile exposed to oxic conditions, you'll potentially have significant differences or characteristically different peat properties between deep and shallow sites, particularly as time goes on and as these systems develop. So with systematic differences in peat properties, and expressed here kind of conceptually with specific yields, so that's how much water table movement you give for a given water input or removal, we might expect to see differences obviously in water table response to drying through evaporative loss. And in fact, that's what we see. So we have water table collected from dozens of sites within the Georgian Bay region. And it seems to support this idea that shallow sites or shallow peatland sites tend to have a more variable water table. So this subset of our data, what it's showing is that the average rate of water table decline during rain-free periods, it tends to be substantially greater in shallow sites versus deep sites. So not only do the shallow sites dry out more quickly compared to the deep sites, but all else being equal, with prolonged drying, shallow sites are going to be at greater risk of completely desaturating. Basically, if they're shallow enough, they're going to totally lose their water table. And in fact, that's exactly what we've seen from our observations. So these figures here, they're showing the water table dynamics for a typical growing season for the area for our peatlands, for both the deep and the shallow sites. So in addition to that difference in water table drawdown, where it tends to be a bit faster in shallow sites, a bit more gradual in the deep sites, the other important thing to take note of is this flatlining of the water table or the measured water table in the shallow sites. And that doesn't mean that the water table stopped moving. It's just that's the lowest datum. We basically hit bedrock. There's no more water table, and it's for a fairly substantial portion of the growing season. So really then the question, obviously the water table dynamics are different, but what's important to know is whether these differences in water table behavior between the shallow and the deep sites have a meaningful difference on moss water availability throughout the growing season, as this might have important implications for water table moss productivity dynamics and even wildfire vulnerability. So briefly, in peatlands, you tend to have different sphagnum species which dominate the ground cover that preferentially grow in relatively dry and wet microhabitats. And so those are hummocks and lawns, where hummocks are the drier microtopography, and lawns or hollows are the relatively wet microtopographic position. So due to differences in moss traits, hummock species tend to be drought avoiders by holding on to their water more tightly. And this is expressed by this just kind of conceptual diagram here, where for a given water table depth, hummock species tend to hold on to their water, they stay more wet, and sustain themselves through drought by just holding on to water and not becoming desiccated. Conversely, lawn species, they tend to be more drought tolerators. And so there's a little bit more that goes into it, but one of the aspects that differentiates the lawn or hollow species is that when it is wet, they tend to have higher productivity. And so they essentially build up stores of energy that can sustain them through periods of drought. So given that the effect of site depth on water table dynamics, there could be important interactions between both species level, moss water availability, and peatland depth. And so in order to examine moss water availability in our study, we measured near surface water and tension in addition to water table over the course of an extended drying period to see whether or not they differed according to both species and site depth. So broadly speaking, the response of the moss water availability to increasing water table depth is more or less what we expected, where you have lower water contents or higher tensions with increasing water table depth. And just for those who might not be familiar, tension here, it's just a measure of water availability, where higher values represent drier conditions. And maybe more importantly, for sphagnum as a species, water stress is thought to occur when tensions are in excess of about 100 millibars. And when you get up to values of, on the order of about 800, this is generally where they're considered to be completely desiccated. So for the deep sites here, we can see that the near surface tension more or less, either falls along or below this 1-to-1 line shown here. And this suggests that water loss due to evapotranspiration is readily replaced at the surface, and it's being sourced up from the water table by capillary forces. In contrast, though, for shallow sites, even though when water table is present, it more or less follows that, that same pattern of near or below this 1-to-1 line of tension to water table depth. Once you lose that water table, you get a big jump in tension, and you're getting it up into that range where sphagnum is expected to be stressed by water stress. But since we only have access to manual measurements, like this is a not a huge amount of temporal sampling here, what we really want is to be able to infer what the stress will be throughout a growing season. So one of the ways that we did that was to develop a simple empirical relationship between moss water stress and one of our continuously measured variables. So in our case, it just happens to be water table depth. So the first step in this process involved just a simple lab experiment where we measured chlorophyll fluorescence. So there's just this chlorophyll fluorescence parameter that represents stress. And we did that for our 2 dominant sphagnum species. So there was a dominant hummock and lawn species for simplicity. And we basically ran a drying experiment where they air dried in a growth chamber. So going from kind of really wet conditions to really dry conditions. And so again, just if people aren't familiar, chlorophyll fluorescence, it's a measure of photosynthetic efficiency. And it's a good proxy for moss stress. And what our lab results show is that there's this threshold-like response in chlorophyll fluorescence to water content, where there appears to be a really rapid change for both species between a water content of about 1 to 5%, give or take. But in order to relate our lab results to our field water table data, we need an intermediate step, right? Because we don't have continuous water table, or sorry, water content data for the near surface. And so to get that intermediate step, we just defined a field-based empirical relationship between water content and water table depth. So that's exactly what we're showing here, where we have water content versus water table for our two dominant hummock and lawn species. And it has that kind of characteristic, or the behavior that we would expect, where the hummock or the species growing in a dry location tends to be more of a drought avoider and holds onto its water. But from a modeling perspective, as you can see, like there's quite a bit of variability about our line of best fit for our empirical relationship. So really to estimate the likelihood of stress for the two dominant sorghum species, we used a Monte Carlo approach, which is going to combine the kind of the fuzzy threshold of 1 to 5. Oh, I'm really running over time. Okay, so yeah, we combine that all together, and what we end up seeing is not terribly surprising, that we see much higher stress in the shallow sites compared to deep sites. But I guess I can't really go over the details, I'm running out of time, but really one of the important things is for the hummock species, which is a drought avoider, you go from conditions where it basically never experiences stress to nearly 1/3 of the growing season it's stressed. And that's virtually all dominated by periods where there is no water table. So that loss of water table is critical for shifting the kind of the hummock locations to these high stress conditions. And again, just since I'm running out of time, running a bit long, basically one of the takeaways is not only can we learn some interesting things from these shallow sites, which are perhaps a bit unusual, but that we propose that further insight can be gained by looking into peatland resilience and examining how other ecohydrological feedbacks in these shallow peat-dominated systems differ between shallow and deep sites. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Harriet, do we have questions?
Yes, we have one question that came in. What was the difference in peat decomposition between shallow site and deep site?
That's a great question. Other people in the group would be in a much better position to answer that. So we've done some chamber measurements, so auto chambers looking at CO2 fluxes, as well as just simple decomposition measurements with tea bags or litter bags. Off the top of my head, I personally don't recall. I focus a little bit more on the hydrology than the carbon side of things.
All right. Well, my question, my suggestion is that you and Fred should go together and basically then determine how you can have a nitrate reducing function for peatlands combined with better protection against fire. But that's just a wild idea here. I think we don't have any further questions. So remember, that the attendees will all receive a survey. So if you could actually fill in that survey, that would be really nice for us to get some feedback on this year's research presentations. I would like to, of course, conclude here this first part of our 2021 World Wetlands Day Symposium. And particularly thank all the speakers, 5 speakers. I think I speak for all. I said you guys gave excellent talks. You also stayed very nicely in time. Of course, I would also like to thank all the attendees. We had at some point over 90 people attending, and I hope to see many of you then this evening at the distinguished lecture and the panel discussion that is being co-hosted by the Waterloo Public Library. So thank you very much, and we'll definitely continue this conversation about wetlands. Thank you.